She didn't arrive with royal blood, political power, or centuries of lineage, but within years, Kate Middleton became the most watched, most analyzed, and quietly the most feared figure inside the monarchy. Because behind palace smiles, opinions about her were forming, and not all of them were kind. It began as something simple. At least, that's how it was presented to the world. A young woman, composed and patient, stepping into a life most could barely imagine. But inside the monarchy, nothing is ever simple. Every arrival is measured. Every gesture is evaluated. And Kate's entry was not just observed, it was dissected. Before we start, your support through a like and subscribe means a lot. Thank you, because this was never just a love story. For centuries, the royal family had operated within an unspoken code, one that favored lineage over personality, tradition over individuality. Outsiders were expected to adjust, to soften themselves, to slowly dissolve into the institution. But Kate did something different. She didn't resist the system. She studied it, quietly, carefully. And by the time she stepped fully into it, she wasn't unprepared. She was already aligned with it in ways that unsettled those who had underestimated her. At first, there was comfort in that. Senior members of the royal family saw her as predictable, safe, a figure who could be shaped, guided, and eventually absorbed into the rhythm of royal life. She didn't speak out of turn. She didn't create chaos. She didn't demand attention. And that, they believed, made her manageable. But what they didn't see, what they didn't expect, was how deliberate that silence was. Because behind the calm expressions and measured appearances, Kate was watching everything. She was learning the rules, not just as they were written, but as they were enforced. She understood the weight of public perception, the fragility of reputation, and the invisible lines that defined power within the palace. And unlike others before her, she never crossed those lines accidentally. Every step she took felt intentional. Every word carefully chosen. Every absence just as meaningful as her presence. It didn't take long for whispers to begin. At first, they sounded like admiration. Words like perfect, flawless, disciplined. But inside royal walls, perfection is never entirely comforting. It raises questions, it invites doubt, because no one is that controlled without reason. No one moves that carefully without purpose. And slowly, admiration turned into something else. Suspicion. There were those who began to wonder whether Kate was simply adapting or something more, whether her quiet consistency was a sign of loyalty or strategy. Because the monarchy survives on tradition, on a system that resists change. And yet, without announcing it, without challenging it openly, Kate seemed to represent something different. Not rebellion, not disruption, but evolution. A shift so subtle it was almost invisible, and that made it far more dangerous. Then came the public. Where the palace saw calculation, the world saw grace. Where insiders questioned her perfection, the public embraced it. And that imbalance began to matter. Because, in a monarchy built on perception, public favor is not just admiration. It is influence. And Kate was gaining it faster than anyone had anticipated, faster than anyone could control. And that was the moment everything began to shift, because suddenly she was no longer just fitting into the institution, she was becoming essential to it. And with that came a new kind of attention, not from the public, but from within, a closer look, a deeper analysis, a quiet, growing awareness that this woman, once seen as an outsider, was no longer on the edge of the monarchy. She was moving toward its center. And the question that once lingered in whispers now pressed harder, sharper, impossible to ignore. Was Kate Middleton simply becoming part of the system? Or was she slowly reshaping it from within? But admiration and suspicion rarely exist alone in royal circles, and as Kate settled into her role, the opinions of those closest to the throne began to reveal something far more complicated. The Queen never raised her voice, never showed open disapproval, but inside the palace, her silence carried more weight than any command. And when it came to Kate Middleton, her true thoughts weren't spoken, they were measured, observed, and hidden behind decades of perfected restraint. By the time Kate had begun settling into her role, the atmosphere around her had already shifted. The whispers had grown quieter, but more focused, because now there was only one opinion that truly mattered, the one that would never be openly declared. The Queen did not need to speak to be understood. Her approval was not given through warmth, nor withdrawn through confrontation. It was revealed in subtleties, in proximity, in timing, in silence. And with Kate, she chose to watch. Not closely in the obvious sense, not in ways that could be interpreted as scrutiny, but in the kind of measured observation that comes from someone who has spent a lifetime reading people without ever revealing her own conclusions. The Queen had seen generations enter the monarchy, some with confidence, others with hesitation, some adapted, others fractured. And so, when Kate arrived, she did not rush to judgment. She waited. Because discipline, to the Queen, was everything. And in Kate, she saw it almost immediately: the composure, the restraint, the ability to endure attention without reacting to it. These were not small qualities. They were survival tools within the monarchy, and Kate wielded them with a precision that felt familiar. Not identical, but aligned. It was enough to create a quiet acknowledgement. Not approval. Not yet. But recognition. Still, there were questions that lingered beneath that surface. Kate's background was not something the monarchy could ignore, even if it chose not to speak of it. She did not come from royal lineage. She did not inherit the unspoken understanding of what this life demanded. And while she had learned quickly, the Queen understood something others often forgot. Learning is not the same as belonging, and belonging, in this world, was everything. But then there was patience. Years of it. Years of waiting, of existing on the edge of royal life without demanding entry into it. That alone shifted something in the Queen's perception. Because patience, in a world defined by entitlement, was rare. And Kate had demonstrated it without complaint, without pressure, without misstep. It wasn't just admirable, it was strategic in a way that couldn't be ignored. And that's when the balance began to change. Because the Queen didn't just see discipline in Kate, she saw control. A level of composure under pressure that few could maintain for long. It wasn't forced. It wasn't performative. It was consistent. And consistency, in a monarchy constantly threatened by unpredictability, was power. But power, even when quiet, does not go unnoticed. There were moments, small, almost invisible, where Kate's influence seemed to extend beyond expectation. Her ability to steady William, to shape public perception without ever appearing to try, to move through the institution without resistance, yet leave a subtle impact behind her. These were not the actions of someone simply adjusting to royal life. These were signs of someone understanding it deeply. And the Queen noticed. She appreciated what Kate brought: stability, loyalty, control. But beneath that appreciation, there was something else, something sharper. A quiet awareness that this woman, who had entered the monarchy as an outsider, was beginning to hold a kind of influence that could not be easily defined or easily limited. Because Kate wasn't just fitting into the system, she was becoming essential to its future. And the Queen, more than anyone, understood what that meant. Approval, in this context, was never simple. It was layered, conditional, strategic. And with Kate, it came with an unspoken understanding that while she had proven herself worthy of the role, she had also become something far more significant than anyone had originally anticipated. Not just a royal, but a force within the monarchy itself. And forces, no matter how composed, are never viewed without caution. And while the Queen's judgment remained hidden beneath layers of royal discipline, others in the family were far less subtle in how they viewed the woman quietly rising through the ranks. To Prince Charles, Kate Middleton was never just a daughter-in-law, she was a variable, one that could either strengthen the monarchy's future or subtly shift its balance of power, and his true thoughts about her were far more strategic than anyone realized. By the time Kate's presence had begun to settle into the rhythm of royal life, Charles had already made up part of his mind, but not all of it. He was not a man who reacted emotionally in matters of the crown. He calculated, he observed, he anticipated consequences long before they arrived. And when he looked at Kate, he didn't just see who she was, he saw what she could become. At first, there was a quiet sense of relief. Because what William had always needed, what Charles himself had struggled to provide, was stability. And Kate brought that without effort, or at least without visible strain. She grounded William in ways that no royal protocol ever could. She softened his edges, steadied his instincts, and created a sense of balance that had been missing for years. And that mattered, not just as a father, but as a future king thinking about succession, legacy, and survival. But relief, in royal terms, is never permanent. Because Charles was also thinking beyond the personal. He had spent decades imagining a monarchy that could evolve without collapsing. A monarchy that could remain relevant in a world that was constantly changing. And in many ways, Kate seemed to align perfectly with that vision. She was modern, but not rebellious, relatable, but still composed. She could connect with the public without breaking the illusion of royal distance. It was, in many ways, exactly what Charles had hoped the future would look like. And yet, there was something about her that didn't sit entirely comfortably. It wasn't what she did, it was how she did it. Because Kate didn't struggle publicly. She didn't stumble. She didn't create the kind of human unpredictability that the monarchy had quietly come to expect from those who entered it. Instead, she moved with a level of control that felt almost deliberate. And to Charles, that raised a different kind of question. Was she adapting to the monarchy or mastering it? There were moments when her influence seemed to stretch beyond her position. Moments when her public presence overshadowed others who technically held more authority. And Charles noticed that. Not with resentment, but with awareness. Because in a system built on hierarchy, influence is supposed to follow rank. And Kate was quietly challenging that without ever breaking a rule. That was the tension. Because Charles admired discipline, he respected restraint. And Kate embodied both. But independence, especially the kind that doesn't announce itself, was something he watched carefully. There were times when he saw her not just as composed, but as controlled, in a way that suggested deeper intention. Not manipulation, not ambition in the obvious sense, but something quieter, something more refined, calculation. And perhaps what unsettled him most was not what she was doing, but how well she was doing it. Because while others spoke, reacted, or revealed themselves through missteps, Kate revealed nothing. She maintained a consistency that made her both admirable and difficult to fully understand. And in a monarchy where unpredictability often exposes weakness, her predictability began to look like strength. Real strength. The kind that doesn't need recognition to be effective. Charles understood something many overlooked, that power inside the monarchy doesn't always come from titles or crowns. It comes from perception, from influence, from the ability to shape how the institution is seen without ever appearing to control it. And Kate was doing exactly that. Quietly, effortlessly, and perhaps without ever needing permission. Which left Charles with a realization he could not ignore, that this woman, who had once been seen as a supportive addition to the royal structure, was beginning to redefine what that structure could look like. Not by force, not by rebellion, but by example. And that kind of change is the hardest to contain. But if Charles viewed Kate through a strategic lens, there was someone far closer to her, someone whose opinion carried both love and pressure in equal measure. Behind closed doors, away from cameras and royal duties, Prince William didn't just see Kate as his wife, he saw her as his anchor. But even love inside the monarchy comes with expectations, and what he truly thinks of her reveals both admiration and unspoken pressure. Because for William, this was never just about partnership, it was survival. He had grown up inside a system that demanded strength, but rarely offered comfort. A world where emotion was controlled, where vulnerability was hidden, and where the weight of expectation arrived long before understanding did. And so, when Kate entered his life, she didn't just fill a role, she became something far more personal. A sense of calm in a world that had always felt unpredictable. A presence that didn't demand, didn't compete, didn't complicate. She steadied him. And that, more than anything, shaped how he saw her. William didn't just admire Kate, he depended on her. Not in a way that diminished him, but in a way that revealed something deeper. She absorbed pressure without reflecting it back. She stood beside him without needing to stand ahead of him. And in a monarchy where roles are rigid and expectations unforgiving, that kind of balance was rare. But reliance, no matter how natural, carries its own weight. Because the more essential someone becomes, the more is quietly expected of them. William knew what Kate represented, not just to him, but to the institution itself. She wasn't simply his wife. She was the future queen. A figure who would one day carry the same scrutiny, the same burden, the same silent obligations that had shaped generations before her. And that understanding changed everything. It added pressure to moments that might otherwise have been simple. It turned personal expectations into institutional ones. And without ever saying it directly, William began to expect something from her that few could sustain. Perfection. Not the kind defined by vanity or appearance, but the kind demanded by survival within the monarchy. The ability to remain composed no matter the circumstance, to never falter publicly, to absorb criticism without reacting, to represent stability even when the world around them shifted unpredictably. And Kate, remarkably, did all of that, again and again. But perfection, even when achieved, comes at a cost. And somewhere beneath William's admiration was a quieter, more fragile thought, one he rarely allowed himself to fully confront. Because he saw her strength, yes, he saw her resilience, her control, her ability to carry weight without visible strain. But he also saw something else, the effort behind it, the moments no one else witnessed, the subtle signs that even the strongest composure requires energy to maintain. And that's where the conflict lived. Not in doubt, but in awareness. Because loving someone who carries so much without complaint doesn't remove the burden. It makes you wonder how long they can continue carrying it. And William understood pressure better than anyone. He had lived it, felt it, watched it shape, and sometimes break, the people around him. And so, even as he relied on Kate, even as he admired her ability to endure, there was a question that lingered quietly beneath everything. What happens if the weight becomes too much? What happens if the one person holding everything together begins to feel it slipping? Because in a world where strength is expected but rarely supported, even the strongest foundations can begin to shift. And William, more than anyone, knew that strength does not make someone unbreakable. It simply makes the cracks harder to see. And that realization, unspoken, unresolved, added a layer to his admiration that few would ever understand. Because loving Kate meant trusting her strength, but it also meant fearing what that strength might be hiding. And inside the monarchy, fear is never expressed openly. It lingers, it waits, it shapes decisions quietly, just beneath the surface. But while William sees her as essential, not everyone in the royal circle shares that sense of admiration, and some views are shaped by rivalry rather than respect. What began as polite smiles and carefully staged appearances quickly unraveled into something far more complicated. Because behind the headlines of unity, Meghan Markle and Kate Middleton weren't just two women in the same family, they were reflections of two completely different futures for the monarchy. At first, everything appeared controlled, respectful, measured. Two women stepping into the same institution, navigating the same expectations, bound by the same unspoken rules. But beneath that surface, something far more fragile was forming. Not open conflict, not immediate division, but a quiet misalignment that neither could fully ignore. Because from the very beginning, they saw the monarchy differently. To Meghan, the system felt restrictive, structured in a way that demanded silence where she believed there should be voice. It asked for restraint where she felt expression was necessary. And when she looked at Kate, she didn't just see a fellow royal. She saw someone who had embraced those expectations completely. Someone who had adapted so seamlessly that it almost seemed effortless. And that, to Meghan, wasn't just impressive. It was concerning, because in her eyes, Kate represented conformity, a version of royal life that required personal compromise in exchange for acceptance. And Meghan had never entered that world intending to compromise who she was. She questioned the silence. She resisted the rigidity. And without ever saying it directly, she began to view Kate not as an ally, but as a symbol of everything she was unwilling to become. But on the other side, Kate was watching too. And what she saw in Meghan was not rebellion. It was unpredictability. Because the monarchy does not bend easily. It doesn't adjust quickly. It survives by maintaining control, by limiting disruption, by ensuring that every member understands the weight of their role. And Meghan, with her openness, her willingness to speak, her emotional clarity, challenged that structure in ways Kate instinctively understood could not be sustained. So where Meghan saw limitation, Kate saw necessity. Where Meghan felt judged, Kate felt caution. Their early interactions reflected that divide: polite, controlled, respectful on the surface, but lacking something deeper. There was no natural ease, no effortless connection. Just two individuals navigating each other carefully, aware that something wasn't aligning, but unable or unwilling to confront it directly. And that silence allowed something else to grow: assumption. Meghan began to feel the weight of Kate's composure, not as support, but as quiet judgment. The steadiness, the restraint, the unshakable calm. It created a contrast that felt impossible to ignore. And in that contrast, Meghan began to question whether she was being measured against a standard she had never agreed to meet. At the same time, Kate was forming her own conclusions, because in Meghan's expressiveness, she saw risk. Not personal risk, but institutional. The monarchy does not absorb emotional unpredictability easily. It doesn't accommodate sudden shifts or open resistance, and Kate, having spent years understanding how the system operates, recognized something Meghan had yet to fully accept. That survival inside the monarchy often means choosing restraint over expression, and that difference, quiet, philosophical, deeply rooted, became the foundation of their divide. It wasn't about personality. It was about belief, about what the monarchy should be and what it should never become. The media would later amplify their tension, turning subtle distance into public narrative. But inside the palace, the truth ran deeper than headlines. Because this wasn't just a disagreement between two individuals, it was a clash between two visions, two directions, two futures, and neither could fully exist alongside the other without consequence. Because if Kate represented stability, Meghan represented change, and the monarchy, as history had shown time and time again, does not embrace both at the same time without fracture. And as that fracture began to form, quietly, invisibly, it didn't stay contained between them. Others were watching. Others were choosing sides. And slowly, the divide between two women became something far more significant. A shift that would ripple through the entire royal family. And as tensions grew between them, other members of the royal family began forming their own opinions, some supportive, others far more critical. Inside the royal family, loyalty isn't always spoken. It's felt, observed, and sometimes withheld. And when it comes to Kate Middleton, opinions aren't unified. They're divided, shaped by personal alliances, generational differences, and quiet judgments that rarely reach the public. Because beyond the structured appearances and carefully maintained unity, the monarchy has always functioned as something far more complex. A network of individuals, each carrying their own perspective, their own loyalties, and their own unspoken opinions. And Kate, whether she intended to or not, had become a focal point within that network. Not just observed from above, but discussed from every direction. There were those who admired her without hesitation. To them, Kate represented everything the monarchy needed, but rarely found. Discipline that never faltered, commitment that never wavered, a sense of duty that didn't demand recognition, but fulfilled itself quietly, consistently, without error. For senior members especially, this was not just admirable, it was reassuring. In a system where unpredictability had caused fractures before, Kate's reliability felt like protection, a safeguard against instability, a presence that could be trusted not to disrupt what had taken generations to preserve. But admiration, even when genuine, is rarely universal. Because for others, particularly those who viewed the monarchy through a more personal lens, Kate's composure raised different questions. There was something about her consistency that felt distant, controlled in a way that created space rather than connection. She was respected, yes, but not always understood. And in a family where emotional distance often lingers beneath formal relationships, that distinction mattered. Among younger members, the perception shifted even further. Kate was often seen as flawless, but in a way that felt difficult to relate to. Her ability to maintain composure, to never visibly struggle, to navigate pressure without revealing its impact, it created a kind of quiet separation. Not hostility, not rejection, but a sense that she'd existed slightly outside the emotional rhythm of those around her. Present, yet not entirely accessible. And that perception began to grow, Because, while some saw strength, others saw something more deliberate, a careful shaping of image, a level of control over how she was perceived that went beyond instinct and into intention. There were whispers, not loud, not confrontational, but persistent, suggestions that Kate understood the power of perception better than most, that she didn't just live within the monarchy's expectations, she managed them. And that idea unsettled certain members, because authenticity within the royal family is a complicated thing. It's expected, but also restricted, encouraged, but only within limits. And Kate's ability to appear both natural and perfectly composed blurred that line in ways that made it difficult to define where sincerity ended and strategy began. Still, even those who questioned her could not deny one thing. She had earned her place, not through confrontation, not through force, but through endurance, through consistency, through an ability to navigate a system that has historically broken those who misread it. And that alone commanded a level of respect that could not be easily dismissed. But respect is not the same as warmth. And inside the monarchy, that difference carries weight. Because while Kate stood at the center of this network of opinions, admired by some, questioned by others, quietly analyzed by all, she remained unchanged on the surface. Composed, steady, unshaken. And perhaps that was what made her presence so powerful. Because no matter how she was perceived, she never adjusted to meet those perceptions. She simply remained consistent. And in a system defined by shifting loyalties and unspoken judgments, consistency becomes something more than stability. It becomes influence. But while the family debates her behind closed doors, the public sees something entirely different, and that contrast may be the most powerful factor of all. To the world, Kate Middleton is grace, composure, and quiet strength. But inside the palace, that same image sparks questions, doubts, and even unease. Because the version of Kate the public loves may not be the same woman the royal family truly sees. Because outside the palace walls, the story feels simple. She is admired, trusted, almost universally accepted as the image of what modern royalty should be. Calm under pressure. Elegant without effort. Present without overwhelming the moment. To the public, Kate represents something rare, a figure who appears both human and untouchable at the same time. And that balance is powerful. It invites loyalty. It builds emotional connection. It creates a sense of certainty in a world that rarely offers it. But inside the monarchy, certainty is never taken at face value. Because perfection, when observed too closely, begins to feel different. Not comforting, but complex. Not reassuring, but carefully constructed. And that's where the divide begins. Because the version of Kate that the world celebrates is the same version that raises quiet questions within the palace. How does someone remain that consistent for that long? Because consistency, in a system built on pressure, is not easy to sustain. It requires discipline, control, awareness, and Kate demonstrates all three with a precision that has become impossible to ignore. She doesn't react. She doesn't falter. She doesn't allow moments of unpredictability to define her. And while that strengthens her public image, it also creates distance internally. Because within the royal family, imperfection is understood. It's expected. It's human. And when someone appears almost untouched by it, it invites curiosity rather than comfort. There are those who feel it quietly. A sense that Kate's presence, while stabilizing, also shifts attention. Her ability to hold public favor so effortlessly places her in a position that doesn't rely on hierarchy. It transcends it. And that, more than anything, changes the balance inside the monarchy. Because influence, once gained from the public, cannot be easily redirected or controlled from within. And Kate has mastered that influence, not through dominance, not through force, but through perception, through an understanding, whether instinctive or learned, of how to exist within the monarchy without becoming consumed by it. She doesn't fight the system. She doesn't challenge it openly. Instead, she aligns with it in a way that strengthens her position without exposing her intentions. And that raises a deeper question. Is this who she truly is? Or is this who she has chosen to become? Because authenticity within the royal family is never fully visible. It exists beneath layers of expectation, obligation, and self-preservation. And Kate's ability to maintain such a seamless image makes it difficult to separate the person from the role, to understand where sincerity ends and strategy begins. But perhaps that distinction no longer matters. Because in the monarchy, image is not separate from reality. It becomes it. And Kate, more than anyone before her, seems to understand that. She has become the version of royalty the public wants to believe in. And in doing so, she has secured something far more powerful than approval. She has secured trust. And trust, once established on that scale, transforms perception into influence. Real influence. The kind that cannot be easily challenged, even from within. And that is where the tension reaches its peak. Because while the public sees stability, the palace sees complexity. While the world sees perfection, those closest to her see something more layered, something harder to define, and perhaps harder to predict. Because if Kate's image continues to grow stronger, more influential, more essential, then the question is no longer about how she is perceived. It becomes about what that perception allows her to do. And as her influence continues to grow, one question becomes impossible to ignore. What happens when perception turns into power? As the monarchy moves toward its next chapter, Kate Middleton is no longer just a member of the royal family. She is its future. And the thoughts others hold about her today may shape what the monarchy becomes tomorrow, whether they're ready for it or not. Because somewhere along the way, without announcement or declaration, her role changed. She is no longer standing beside the system. She is becoming central to it. What once appeared as support has transformed into something far more significant. Influence that moves quietly but steadily. Authority that does not need to be claimed because it is already being felt. And within the monarchy, that kind of shift does not go unnoticed. It creates tension. It forces reflection. It challenges long-standing assumptions about where power truly comes from. Because Kate was never supposed to become this. An outsider who adapts? Yes. A partner who supports? Certainly. But a figure who begins to define the future of the monarchy? That was never part of the expectation. And yet, step by step, moment by moment, that is exactly what has happened. There are those who see it clearly and welcome it. To them, Kate represents the monarchy's greatest strength. A bridge between tradition and modernity. A figure who understands the weight of history but is not trapped by it. Her composure, her consistency, her ability to maintain trust, these are not just personal qualities. They are assets, foundations upon which the future can be built. But not everyone views it that way. Because with influence comes a different kind of concern. Not loud, not openly expressed, but present, persistent. A question that lingers beneath conversations, behind measured expressions, within the quiet spaces where real thoughts exist. How much control will she eventually hold? Because Kate's power does not follow traditional paths, it doesn't rely on hierarchy alone. It exists in perception, in public trust, in the ability to shape how the monarchy is seen without ever appearing to shape it at all. And that makes it difficult to define, difficult to limit, difficult to predict. She represents stability, but also something else. Change. Not the disruptive kind, not the kind that announces itself through conflict, but the kind that unfolds gradually, almost invisibly, until suddenly everything feels different. And by the time it is recognized, it is already too late to reverse. That is where the monarchy now stands, at a threshold. Because Kate's journey, from outsider to future queen, is not just unprecedented. It is transformative. It challenges the idea that the monarchy is unchangeable, that its structure is fixed, that its future is already decided. And if that idea begins to shift, then everything built upon it begins to shift as well. The family feels it, not always in words, not always in actions, but in awareness, in the understanding that adaptation may no longer be optional, that resisting change may carry greater risk than accepting it, and that Kate, whether intentionally or not, has become the center of that decision, because she is no longer simply being observed, she is being measured against the future itself. And perhaps what unsettles some is not what she has done, but what she represents. A monarchy that evolves quietly. A system that reshapes itself without breaking. A future that does not look exactly like the past. And Kate stands at the center of that possibility, admired for her strength, questioned for her control, respected for her consistency, and, in some quiet corners, feared for what that combination might become when fully realized. Because when influence reaches a certain point, it no longer needs permission to exist. It simply becomes